Greetings! We are all witnesses to the bloody war of Russia against Ukraine. Many believe that this is the first event of its kind and that there have been no previous Russo-Ukrainian wars in history. However, this is not the case. This is far from the first, though I hope it will be the last, war between these two neighboring states. I want to tell you about two Russo-Ukrainian wars that occurred between 1917 and 1921, the first in 1917 to 1918, and the second in 1918 to 1921. While analyzing the course of these wars, I noticed striking similarities between Russia's policy towards Ukraine in 1917 to 1921 and what we are witnessing today. Somehow, the main stages of Russian aggression, the tactical and even strategic approaches, and often the key themes of Russian propaganda coincide. Therefore, it is worth taking a closer look at these similarities, as this will allow us to identify the aggressor's patterns of behavior and formulate the key lessons necessary to understand Russia's actions. Let's start from the very beginning. Before 1917, most of Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, while its western part was within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, in early March 1917, a democratic revolution took place in Russia, leading to the establishment of a more democratic regime in the country. In these new conditions, Ukrainians who aspired to autonomy managed to achieve it. In the summer of 1917, Ukraine's autonomy within Russia was declared, and governing bodies for this autonomy were established. The representative body, known as the Central Rada, was led by historian Miol Hrushevsky, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, while the head of the government was appointed as the Social Democrat and writer Volodymyr Vinichenko. However, it seems that Russians are not accustomed to living under democratic conditions, finding it more comfortable to live under authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. On November 7, 1917, the Bolshevik coup took place in Petrograd, leading to the Bolsheviks seizing power in Russia and establishing a totalitarian regime far more brutal than the previous one. The democratic government of Ukraine did not recognize the legitimacy of this coup, and on November 20th, the Central Rada proclaimed the creation of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Russian Bolsheviks immediately began preparing to seize Ukraine. What is noteworthy here are their methods, which strikingly resemble those of Putin's leadership today. First and foremost, this is an attempt to take control of Ukraine from within by installing a collaborationist regime that would be convenient for Russia. In the early 21st century, this is exactly how Putin's leadership began, facilitating the rise to power of President Yanukovych. In 1917, the Russian Bolsheviks began with similar actions. Ukrainian communists, many of whom were direct Russian agents, initiated the convening of the All-Ukrainian Congress of Workers, Peasants, and Soldiers' Deputies on December 17, 1917, in Kyiv. The goal was to transfer power to the Bolsheviks in Ukraine, just as the All-Russian Congress of Soviets formally proclaimed Bolshevik power in Russia. The Congress lasted 3 days, but the Bolsheviks' plan failed miserably. The overwhelming majority of delegates supported the Central Rada. The subsequent events are easy to predict. Think back to what Russia did in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. A group of Russian military personnel invaded the Donbas region, and with the help of collaborators and direct Russian agents, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics were created, launching military actions in Ukraine with the support and direct involvement of the Russian military. In 1917, Russia similarly began by creating a puppet republic, but the plan was even more ambitious. As you might guess, in order to establish a puppet republic, it was necessary to capture at least a small part of Ukraine. So, on December 23, 1917, Bolshevik troops suddenly invaded the territory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, and captured part of the city of Kharkiv. The Ukrainian garrison in Kharkiv continued to resist, but this did not stop Russia's further actions. On December 24, 25, the work, in quotation marks, of the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets was continued in the now occupied part of Kharkiv. On December 25th, the Congress proclaimed the creation of the so-called Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets, with its center in Kharkiv. From that point on, there were two Ukrainian People's Republics, one with its center in Kiev and the other with its center in Kharkiv. In other words, the Russian Bolsheviks created an alternative puppet quasi-state entirely dependent on them, in opposition to the legitimate Ukrainian People's Republic. This allowed them to formally remain on the sidelines of the war, portraying it as a civil conflict. Thanks to these manipulations, the events in Ukraine during this period are still interpreted as a civil war, and the term Russo-Ukrainian War does not exist in Russian historiography. On December 30th, the Kharkiv Ukrainian People's Republic declared war on the real UPR. Thus, in early January 1918, a large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops began. Unfortunately, the leadership of the Ukrainian People's Republic, much like Ukraine in 2014, was completely unprepared to repel the aggression, and for the same reasons as the modern Ukrainian leadership. At the beginning of the 21st century, the Ukrainian leadership and society in general did not believe that Russia was capable of initiating military aggression. They relied on the treaty with Russia signed a few years earlier and expected that the international community would not allow such aggression. In 1917, the leaders of the Ukrainian People's Republic also did not consider Russia a threat. Both Hrushevsky and Vinichenko, when warned by politicians urging stronger defense of the country, stated, "We have nothing to divide with Russian democracy." Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, the Ukrainian leaders at that time were socialists who adhered to the dominant socialist belief that a standing army was an attribute of the old authoritarian society. In a new democratic society, there should be no standing army, and if necessary, the country would be defended by a people's militia composed of volunteers. Naturally, after the onset of Russian aggression, no mobilization was announced, and instead, they began to create a militia-type army. Thus, by January 1918, the Ukrainian army consisted of separate volunteer units, with a total strength of no more than 20,000 men. These units exhibited the typical shortcomings of a people's militia: weak military discipline, occasional lack of resilience in battle, and so on. However, through combat, the best units were able to overcome these deficiencies and became quite capable fighting forces. What was the nature of the Russian Bolshevik army at that time? It was also a volunteer army, like the Ukrainian one, as this aligned with the core principles of communist doctrine. However, the Bolsheviks quickly realized their mistake and began forming a regular Red Army with strict discipline in 1918, while in Ukraine, the principle of a people's militia was upheld even into 1919. Who comprised the Russian forces at the beginning of 1918? These troops were known as the Red Guard and consisted of Bolsheviks from Russian cities, primarily Moscow, Kostroma, and Ryazan, sailors of the Baltic Fleet, as well as workers from industrial cities in Ukraine, primarily Donbass and Yekaterinoslav, who supported the invasion. In total, there were about 70,000 troops. Most of these military units lacked discipline had little resilience in battle and were poorly commanded. The soldiers were easily panicked and prone to looting. Repelling this onslaught was theoretically possible with proper military organization, but systemic errors in the organization of the Ukrainian army prevented this from happening. So, on January 7, 1918, the Russian Bolshevik Army, under the banner of the Kharkiv Ukrainian People's Republic, launched a large-scale offensive against Ukraine. On February 9th, the Russian army captured Kyiv. After that, Bolshevik forces seized a significant part of Ukraine's territory. The troops of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, and government institutions were evacuated to Volyn. The course of the First Russo-Ukrainian War changed significantly after UPR signed the Brest-Litovsk Peace Treaty with the Central Powers on February 9, 1918. The main point of this treaty was that Austria-Hungary and Germany pledged to help restore the territorial integrity of the UPR, while the UPR, in turn, committed to signing a trade agreement for the supply of agricultural products. To fully understand the importance of this treaty, not only for Ukraine, but also for Germany, it should be noted that by the fourth year of the war, Germany was experiencing severe famine, while Ukraine, as it does now, produced a surplus of agricultural products. Eyewitnesses noted that German soldiers, while in Kyiv, fainted at the sight of the display windows of grocery stores. Thanks to the signing of the peace treaty on February 18th, the German-Austrian-Ukrainian forces launched an offensive against the Bolsheviks. On March 2, 1918, UPR units entered Kyiv, followed by the Germans. Within a few months, the entire territory of the UPR was cleared of Bolsheviks. On June 12, 1918, a treaty was signed between the RSFSR and the Ukrainian state. According to this treaty, hostilities ceased, and a neutral zone was established between the states to separate the sides until official state borders were determined. The First Russo-Ukrainian War came to an end. But if you think that the Russian Bolsheviks intended to strictly adhere to this treaty, you are greatly mistaken. There was no need to wait long for a suitable opportunity. On November 11, 1918, Germany acknowledged its defeat in World War I. German soldiers began returning home, and Ukraine lost its only ally. On November 28, 1918, the Provisional Workers and Peasants Government of Ukraine was established in the city of Kursk. Armed formations under this government's control began an invasion of Ukraine. The Second Russo-Ukrainian War began. The Bolsheviks then repeated the same trick they used at the start of the First Russo-Ukrainian War. On January 3, 1919, the Bolsheviks captured Kharkiv, and on January 6th, the Provisional Government of Ukraine, already based in Kharkiv, approved a new name for the state, Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. The Russian maneuver was successful. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the UPR government sent a note of protest to the Bolshevik government in Moscow. However, in response to this note, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of Russia, Georgy Chicherin, replied that there were no troops of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic on Ukrainian territory, and that the war against the UPR was being waged by a completely independent Ukrainian Soviet government. On February 5, 1919, the Red Army once again occupied Kyiv, and fighting continued across the entire front in Ukraine. However, a new player entered the events in Ukraine, the anti-communist Russians, known as the White Guards. In January 1919, they organized the Armed Forces of South Russia under the command of General Denikin. It would seem obvious that the Russian enemies of the Communists, joining forces with their Ukrainian counterparts, the UPR, should have worked together to defeat their common enemy and restore constitutional order across the former Russian Empire. But we forget that the White Guards were also Russians, and the idea of an independent Ukraine was as unacceptable to them as it was to the Communists. In May 1919, the White Guards invaded Ukraine and began fighting both the Red Army and the UPR Army. The White Guards not only refused to recognize the aspirations of Ukrainians for independence, but they also denied the very existence of the Ukrainian people. In the territories they occupied, they shut down Ukrainian newspapers and magazines, introduced Russian-only instruction in state schools, and persecuted any expression of Ukrainian identity. In agricultural policy, they pursued the restoration of landowner estates. The result was a wave of uprisings against the White Guards throughout Ukraine. The rebellious peasants formed dozens of detachments and units, some of which were quite large. It is enough to say that Nestor Makhno's insurgent army numbered between 80,000 and 100,000 people. The overwhelming majority of these insurgents fought against the White Guards on the side of the Communists. But why not in the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic? Here, we need to take a brief detour. The first Russo-Ukrainian War, and especially the White Guard invasion, taught the Communists a great deal. The main lesson they learned was that overtly anti-Ukrainian policies and Ukrainophobic rhetoric were futile. As early as March 1919, the full state independence of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic was proclaimed and its constitution was adopted. According to this constitution, the Ukrainian SSR was completely independent, with its own army, its own executive committee of Soviets, and its own ruling party, the Communist Party of Bolsheviks of Ukraine. Of course, there was no real independence, but this wasn't immediately apparent to an outside observer. Now, opponents of the White Guards no longer faced a dilemma of whom to fight for, Russia or Ukraine. The question now was, which independent Ukraine will I defend, the Ukrainian People's Republic or the Ukrainian Socialist Republic? Well, you can guess whose promises were more appealing. Ukrainian Democrats could only promise what they intended to deliver, while the Communists promised everything their audience wanted to hear. As a result, a significant portion of Ukrainian workers and peasants sided with the Communists. Workers were attracted by the idea of fighting for a state of workers and peasants, believing that they would become the owners of factories and plants. Did the Communists keep this promise? No. The industrial enterprises became state property, and the workers now worked not for a private owner, but for the state, much like the inhabitants of ancient Egypt. Did the peasants get what they wanted? It seemed so. The land was proclaimed the property of the working people and was to be distributed among the peasants for equal use. However, it should be noted that the land was not given to the peasants as property, but for use, meaning that the land did not become the property of the peasants, but of the state. The peasants, who were once free owners, were turned into mere users without any rights to the land. Thus, in the early 1930s, the state easily took all the land back and forced the peasants into so-called collective farms, where they essentially became serfs. To crush the resistance of the Ukrainian peasantry, the Communists orchestrated the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, during which 3 to 5 million people died. But the Communists managed to alienate the peasants right after their victory over Denikin. They introduced a food requisition policy, according to which all surplus grain from peasant farms was seized at fixed state prices, which, in those circumstances, meant almost for free. Oh, how the peasants rose up in anger. Practically all the peasant insurgent detachments that had fought on the side of the Russian Communists against both the White Guards and the Ukrainian People's Republic's army revolted against the Bolsheviks. However, it was already too late. The insurgent peasants were declared bandits, and since they had no state, no army, and no allies, all the uprisings were crushed. This is how Russia managed to subjugate the Ukrainian people and deprive Ukraine of statehood in 1917 to 1921. Ukraine only restored its statehood in 1991. The war that is happening now is a continuation of the First and Second Russian-Ukrainian wars undertaken with the same goal, to once again subjugate the Ukrainian people and strip Ukraine of its statehood. Goodbye.